Jack Tanner had just returned from a grueling business trip, the kind that stretched endlessly across time zones, with meetings that blurred together in a fog of corporate jargon. As his flight landed in the late hours of the evening, he found himself craving rest more than anything else. His tired eyes scanned the road ahead as he drove through a desolate stretch of forest, the GPS on his phone blinking weakly as it guided him to a nearby hotel. The sky had opened up just as he approached the hotel, rain pelting down in thick sheets. The forest that surrounded the building was shrouded in darkness, the trees looming like silent sentinels in the night. Jack barely managed to park his car before dashing through the downpour, his briefcase held over his head in a vain attempt to stay dry. As he burst into the lobby, the door clattering shut behind him, Jack took a moment to catch his breath. The hotel was small and old, the kind of place that had seen better days. The lobby was dimly lit, the bulbs overhead flickering occasionally as if struggling to stay alive. The furniture was outdated, worn around the edges, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The man at the front desk emerged from a back room with obvious reluctance. He was in his 30s, with a gaunt face and tired eyes, as if he'd been stuck behind that counter for decades. He didn't smile as Jack approached, dripping wet and bedraggled. "Are there any free rooms?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse from the long day. The man nodded, though he hesitated slightly. "Yes," he answered, his tone flat. He reached behind the desk, pulling out a key and handing it over. Jack noticed the man's fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his own, but he was too exhausted to care. "First floor down the hall," the man instructed, his eyes avoiding Jack's. Jack thanked him with a nod and made his way to his room. The hallway was dimly lit, the carpet beneath his feet worn and threadbare. The door to his room creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a modest space with a single bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out into the dark forest. The sound of rain against the glass was almost soothing, lulling him into a sense of security. He undressed quickly, leaving his wet clothes in a heap on the floor, and slipped under the covers. The bed was firm, not uncomfortable, but certainly not inviting. Exhaustion washed over him as he closed his eyes, his body finally giving in to the need for sleep. But Jack woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. The red digits on the alarm clock blinked 3 a.m., casting an eerie glow in the room. A strange feeling gnawed at his gut, like a sixth sense warning him of something amiss. He felt it deep in his bones, a prickling sensation that told him he was not alone. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Everything was exactly as it had been when he'd fallen asleep. Yet the feeling persisted. He felt eyes on him, watching him from somewhere in the darkness. Jack's gaze was drawn to the window. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest in a ghostly haze. He could barely make out the shapes of the trees, their branches twisted and gnarled like skeletal hands reaching out from the earth. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw it. Standing in the fog, about 20 meters from his window, was a tall figure. At first, Jack thought it might be a trick of the light, or his sleep-deprived mind playing games with him. But the figure didn't disappear. It stood there, still and silent, staring directly at him. It was a woman. Or at least, it appeared to be a woman, tall and gaunt, with long hair that hung in wet strands around her face. Her eyes, God, her eyes, seemed to bore into Jack's very soul, unblinking and intense. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, a primal fear taking hold of him. He wanted to look away, to convince himself that it was just a shadow, just his imagination, but he couldn't. He was transfixed, unable to tear his gaze away from those eyes. Suddenly, the figure moved. It began to drift to the right, almost gliding through the fog, heading toward the road that led to the hotel. Jack's fear intensified. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of that room, out of that hotel, and never look back. But something kept him rooted to the spot, as if those eyes held him in place. His logical mind tried to reason with him. Maybe it was just a woman lost in the forest, Maybe she was mentally ill, or maybe she was just a figment of his exhausted mind. But the fear wouldn't go away. It gnawed at him, growing stronger with every passing second. Jack forced himself to lie back down, pulling the covers up to his chin like a child hiding from monsters. He tried to calm his racing heart, telling himself over and over that there was nothing to be afraid of, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too alert, too aware of the creeping dread that had settled over him. Then he heard it. Soft, measured footsteps, coming from down the hallway. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the rain, but they grew louder, closer with each passing moment. Someone was walking down the hall, heading straight for his room. Panic gripped Jack. His breath hitched and he tensed up. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. The footsteps stopped right outside his door. Jack held his breath, straining to listen. The silence was deafening and his heart pounded in his ears. And then a sharp knock on the door. Jack nearly jumped out of his skin, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He stared at the door, wide-eyed, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. But there was no answer, only another knock. Harder this time, more insistent. Jack's fear surged, and he felt that heavy stare through the door, cold and unrelenting. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was on the other side was desperate to get in. Jack's mind raced, but he couldn't think of anything to do. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. But the silence that followed was even worse. Jack heard something else, a soft, scratching sound, like nails scraping against the wood of the door. It went on for what felt like an eternity, each scratch sending shivers down his spine. Finally, the scratching ceased, leaving only the sound of Jack's ragged breathing in the room. He wanted to move, to do anything to shake off the fear, but he couldn't. He sat on the bed, his body rigid, his eyes glued to the door, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move, but nothing happened. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. Jack didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He didn't dare move from his spot on the bed, too afraid to even close his eyes. When the first rays of dawn finally pierced through the window, Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The terror of the night seemed to dissipate with the light of day, though it still lingered at the edges of his mind. He packed his things quickly, eager to leave that room, that hotel, and never return. As he reached for the door, something caught his eye. There, on the wood, were deep scratches, gouged into the surface as if made by claws. And in those scratches a word had been carved. Mine. Goosebumps ran up Jack's arms, and he felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He needed to get out, needed to leave this place behind as quickly as possible. Downstairs, the man at the front desk was waiting, his face pale and drawn. When Jack approached him, he could see the worry in the man's eyes. Did you experience anything strange last night?" Jack asked, his voice shaking. The man's face went even paler, and he looked away, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have told you. I should have warned you." Jack felt his heart drop into his stomach. "Warned me about what?" The man took a deep breath, then looked Jack in the eye. "A few months ago, a woman checked into the room you stayed in. She was troubled. She took her own life in that room, hanged herself from the ceiling fan." Jack felt the blood drain from his face, the room spinning slightly as he struggled to process what he'd just heard. The man continued, his voice tinged with regret. Jack was silent, the weight of the man's words settling over him like a shroud. He forced himself to nod, though his mind was reeling. "I'm sorry," the man repeated, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have told you, but we need the business." Jack didn't say anything else. He simply nodded, handed over his key, and left the hotel as quickly as he could. The drive back home was a blur, his mind too preoccupied with the events of the night to focus on anything else. Days passed, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He tried to push the memory to the back of his mind, to convince himself that it was just a nightmare, that it wasn't real. But the image of that woman, standing in the fog, her eyes locked onto his, haunted his every waking moment. One evening, as Jack was browsing the internet, he came across an article that made his blood run cold. It was about the woman who had died in that hotel, the one who had hanged herself in the room where Jack had stayed. The article included a photo of her grave, tucked away in a small cemetery on the outskirts of town. Jack stared at the photo for a long time, a sense of dread gnawing at him. He knew he couldn't rest until he faced this head-on, until he put this chapter behind him. So, he made a decision. The next morning, Jack drove to the cemetery. It was a small, quiet place, surrounded by trees, with headstones that dated back centuries. He found her grave easily enough. It was covered in flowers, fresh and vibrant, as if someone had been there recently. Jack stood before the grave for a long time, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. He felt sorry for her, this woman who had been so tormented in life that she had seen no other way out. He wondered what had driven her to such despair, what horrors she had faced alone. Finally, Jack knelt down and placed a bouquet of flowers on her grave. He said a quiet prayer, asking for her soul to find peace and for the fear that had gripped him to be lifted. As he stood to leave, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The anxiety that had plagued him since that night began to melt away, replaced by a sense of calm. He knew he had done the right thing, that he had honored her memory in some small way. Jack returned to his life, the memory of that night gradually fading into the background. He was able to move on, to live his life without the shadow of fear hanging over him. But every now and then, when the night was particularly dark and the wind whispered through the trees, he would think of her, the woman in the fog, and he would wonder if, somewhere out there, she had finally found peace.